Alright, what's going on, guys? The world and story of Elden Ring is ripe with mystery, and now that we have the DLC released and all available information that we'll get about the lore, we can now take an objective look overall and see where the bits of story are that still at this point in time feel unexplained and the perfect place to throw in a wild theory. So today we are going to be taking a deep dive into the full Elden Ring lore theory iceberg. Now, I had planned to make a full iceberg myself with you guys in the Discord server. However, one of you sent me this one that was posted to the Elden Ring Lore Talk Reddit by Malefic Tech X, and this one's actually really good. It does a great job at covering some of the biggest mysteries in the lore, and if you're unfamiliar with how these icebergs work, basically, starting at the top you'll get some of the most well-known lore theories, and as you go further down, they get weirder, more obscure, and require a lot more detail to talk about. So today we're going to go through the first two tiers, as many of these don't require lengthy explanations, and many of you will already know about. However, there's still plenty here, even for the most experienced lore enthusiasts to wonder about. And one final thing before we get started, when we finish this series, I'm going to upload them all as one long video, so that you don't have to go back through every one of them, and I will likely add a few things to the lower tiers, because I think there are some really good mysteries that weren't placed on this iceberg that I think deserve a spot, but I'm not going to take any out. So as we get started, if you want to see more of this series, be sure to leave a like on this video, and subscribe if you're new around here. But now let's get started. Beginning in Tier 1, the first topic of the day is Marika is Numen. Now, Numen have always been a mysterious part of Elden Ring's lore. When you start up the game and choose the race for your character, you have an option of Numen, with a description that says the face of the Numen, supposed denizens of another world, long-lived but seldom born. Now, the connection to Marika comes from the Black Knife armor set, which has a description that reads, "The assassins that carried out the deeds of the Knight of the Black Knives were all women, and rumored to be Numen, who had close ties with Marika herself." We then have Marika's hammer, which is said to be made in the land of the Numen. We never learn where that land is. However, the DLC introduces us to Shaman Village, which is inferred to be Marika's homeland. So are these so-called Numen actually the shamans from the Land of Shadow, just given a different name after the Land of Shadow was sealed away? It's still a big mystery. Up next we have what's behind the cloud. And this refers to an idea that was going around before the DLC, where if you look at the full map of the base game, in the very center there is a giant cloud. And this used to be a popular idea theorizing where the DLC would be located, since it's very conspicuous and looks like it could be hiding something. And what made this much weirder is that people took it upon themselves to travel to the spot where that cloud is in the actual overworld by using cheats, and when they got there, they would find an unloaded chunk that opened up to a void. It's just a giant blank square beneath the water in the middle of the ocean. Now, since this obviously shouldn't exist, the popular theory in the community was that this was a marker where the DLC map would eventually go. And to an extent, it was correct. Even though the Land of Shadow is not physically loaded in the middle of the map, you can find the tower that says here marks the very center of the lands between. So at least according to the lore, that is where the Land of Shadow is located, even if it's not physically there in a gameplay sense. So the cloud on the map is likely just representative of the Land of Shadow being physically veiled. But that memory in the time of Hunt and the community was a lot of fun. Eclipse theory comes from the lore presented in Castle Sol, that tells the story of Miquella trying to start an eclipse in order to revive the soulless demigods. And throughout the level you can find ghosts that will tell you about this, one in particular that laments over Miquella's eclipse not coming to fruition and his comrade remaining soulless. The theory itself presents the idea that Godwyn might have been the comrade that's being referenced here, according to the lore of the Golden Epitaph, where Miquella calls Godwyn Lord Brother and wants him to die a true death. This theory was also used as justification for the Battle of Aeonia, as since Radahn was halting the stars, that would in theory halt the possibility of an eclipse. And this is why a lot of people thought Godwyn would be the final boss of the DLC and be Miquella's consort, as the eclipse would have revived Godwyn's soul from beyond death, and he would have become Miquella's lord. And even personally, I think that would have been a much better storyline than what we got with Radahn. As in context of what we now know, pretty much everything to do with Castle Sol has to only be applied to the nameless demigods of the mausoleums, which still works in fairness, but it's a pretty big downplay than what everyone originally thought, since again the only reference we have between Miquella calling someone their lord or comrade is Godwyn. The island in the ocean, I believe, refers to distant lands that you can see when looking out into the ocean. If you go to the northern parts of the map and use a telescope, looking very closely on the horizon, you can see land, very mountainous and craggy, but entirely inaccessible and undetailed. Now, much like the hole in the center of the map beneath the cloud, a lot of people thought this was some kind of hint to where the DLC would be. And we do have lots of references in the game of lands beyond the sea, such as the Land of Reeds and the Badlands. And even the name of the lands between begs the question of between what? Now, in a practical sense, I think these are just renders for the sake of creating the world, even though we do know of other lands in Elden Ring's universe. I think these are just there for the sake of creating an environment and adding a little more detail. But it is FromSoftware we're talking about. You never know with these kind of things. After all, you can find boat wreckage on every single coast, so they had to come from somewhere. The dead giant giants. Now, if you've explored the map of Elden Ring, one thing you've likely noticed, specifically in Caelid or the mountaintops, are massive giants decomposing beneath the ground. But the thing is, these giants are like 100 times bigger than the actual giants we see in the game. They make the Erdtree look small. But the problem is we have no references to what they were, or even when they were alive. But they do play into the idea of Elden Ring's themes, with societies being built on those that came before, and others being erased entirely from history, as we saw with the DLC in the Land of Shadow. But regardless, the fact is these giants are just way too big in context of anything in the game. There is nothing relative to their size. So whatever world they occupied, and whatever their society looked like, we have currently no way of knowing. Ranni's rune on the moon. This is an interesting one, and it was one of the very first lore theories in Elden Ring after the game came out. When you talk to Gideon and ask him about the unlocated demigods, he will tell you that Ranni discarded her great rune, so she's no longer a concern to the Round Table hold, which then causes us to ask the question of where did she discard her rune? Well, since Ranni has such close ties with the moon, it is a bit odd that when you look at it, it looks like it has a rune imprinted on it. You can see the lines and hatches that are definitely not what you would normally see on the moon. And in Ranni's ending, she's creating a sort of portal that looks like the moon to send the Elden Ring away. So at first, while you may think this sounds ridiculous, I do think it's a fair theory. Definitely a fun one to think about. Next up we have the Gloam-Eyed Queen. And if you're a lore enthusiast, then you know all too well about this character. For a basic summary of what this character is, the Gloam-Eyed Queen is a character associated with the Godskins, who was the leader of the Godskin Hunt, a war against the gods. She was the wielder of Destined Death and the Black Flame, but was defeated by Malekith the Black Blade. There's a number of other attributes associated with the Gloam-Eyed Queen, such as that she was a mother to the Godskins, and was also an Empyrean, meaning a candidate for godhood. Now, the Gloam-Eyed Queen is only mentioned a handful of times in item descriptions, and that's it, but that makes her a very good subject for theories, the most prominent of which is that Melina at the end of the Frenzied Flame cutscene either is or has become the Gloam-Eyed Queen. The Gloam-Eyed Queen is a character many were hoping to see in the DLC, but we ultimately didn't, and so all of the theories surrounding the identity are still up in the air and may not ever be fully explained. Miquella is Saint Trina. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this one because this isn't really a theory. It's just a fact that not many people will catch on to if they don't pay attention to the lore. Saint Trina and Miquella are two parts of the same being. Much like how Marika and Radagon are the same, Saint Trina represents another part of Miquella with his aspects of love and compassion. And when we find Saint Trina in the DLC, she has been divested from Miquella, turning into a wilted lily. But throughout the base game, we got some secondhand accounts of Saint Trina, described as this deity of sleep. But back then, it was never outright confirmed that Miquella and Saint Trina were one and the same. However, in the DLC, that fact is confirmed. So now we know. But even though that was a very basic touch on Saint Trina, don't worry, it'll come up a lot more further down the iceberg. Now the final one in tier 1 today, the Erdtree is fake. I believe this refers to an idea popularized by tarnished archaeologists that claims that the Erdtree isn't actually physical, or at least the gold of it isn't, but rather a collective vision of the people of the lands between. This comes from the item description of the Blessed Dew Talisman, which reads, "It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith." So this idea takes that line literally, posing that only those with eyes to see the gold of the Erdtree, and those stripped of the grace of gold only see the dead tree beneath. It's an interesting idea. I don't think I'm 100% on board with it, but I see the vision. And especially in context of the DLC and the Shadow Tree, it's implied that the Shadow Tree is actually how the denizens of the Land of Shadow see the Erdtree. So you could argue that the concept is already at play. Now again, I'm not totally on board with the idea. I would need to see a little bit more evidence, but I do think it's a cool theory. Now we move further down into tier 2, and things definitely start to get much weirder from here on out. So even the most experienced lore enthusiast may find something new here, but if you're someone that isn't so deep into it, there's a lot here that might surprise you. And we begin tier 2 with the mushroom theory. Now if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, then you'll be very familiar with the mushroom theory, as its origins are right here. I started the mushroom theory as an attempt to explain a lot of the weird imagery we see going on in the Erdtree, specifically with it being two very distinct trees, with a dead tree beneath the gold coating. And we see behavior up in the branches specifically that resembles a slime mold, coupled with the idea that the roots of the Erdtree are fertilized by bodies. Then by viewing the Erdtree as a giant decomposing organism, then we can get a clearer picture into some of the themes that Elden Ring is trying to present. But that's only one small portion of the mushroom theory. It also goes much deeper in explaining what the two fingers actually are, their basis in a real-life mushroom called the Dead Man's Fingers, and generally just how Elden Ring uses mushroom imagery to communicate one of its overarching themes of power from death. This is only scratching the surface, and I'll put up a few other things on screen to communicate just how deep this idea goes. And if any of that sounds interesting, I highly recommend just checking out the full-length video on this, because it's hard to really paint the picture in a very small segment in this video. The next point is Empyrean Grandam, and this refers to the horn-scent Grandam that we can find in the DLC in Belorat. If you talk to her while wearing the Divine Beast head, she will give you a spell called Watchful Spirit, and in the description of that spell, at least when the game came out, it referred to her as the Empyrean Grandam. Now obviously this had the lore community on a big hunt, because the word Empyrean has big connotations, as Empyreans are the candidates to become the next gods, chosen by the Fingers, as well as lots of other interesting implications. So this had people asking, well, is she an Empyrean? Is this referring to her nature as a tower folk and their sort of divinity? Or was there another reason this word was used? Well, this discussion was put to rest in patch 1.13 because they actually changed the description of this spell to refer to her as the Horn-scent Grandam, just as her map marker did. But it still does make you wonder, what did they mean by calling her the Empyrean Grandam originally? We may never know. Jars fertilize the Erdtrees. This deals with the fact that at the base of all the Erdtrees, we can find smashed living jars. Now, if you paid attention to the context clues in the game, you would have figured out by now what's inside the jars. Those contents, of course, being bodies of the inhabitants of the lands between. This is why we find living jars all throughout the catacombs and around the graveyards, and they explode into organic meat when killed. Now, based off the thought we mentioned earlier that the roots of the Erdtree itself are sustained by bodies, then the logical conclusion here is that the minor Erdtrees function in a similar manner. So when we find the Erdtree avatars surrounded by a bunch of smashed jars, we can likely conclude that it's the job of the Erdtree avatar to smash the jars and use their contents as fertilizers for the minor Erdtrees. And it's the job of the jars themselves to go out and collect the bodies, stuff them into themselves, and go to die at the foot of the trees. So leave it to FromSoftware to make these lovable jars have such a twisted backstory. This next one's pretty interesting. Empyreans have one eye. Now, this idea plays on a lot of visual evidence, but arguably falls short for the same reason. We know of a few Empyreans in the game, and we see them as well. The confirmed ones being Ranni, Miquella, Malenia, Marika, and the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Now you'll notice when looking at Ranni, she has one eye, with the other sealed shut. Marika at the end of the game is also missing an eye, at least if you account for the broken part of her head. Miquella and Malenia are a bit different because at least for Malenia, both of her eyes are shut by the Scarlet Rot, and we don't actually get to see Miquella's eyes opened at any point in the game. And the missing eye trend is not exclusive to Empyreans, as Messmer only has one eye, and the same is true for Mohg, as well as Melina, although you can argue that she may be the Gloam-Eyed Queen, which could use this as a bit of evidence. So while I do think there is significance to the whole one-eye trend, I don't think it's necessarily a direct sign of an Empyrean, but it could still be the case, we just don't have any way to prove it. Miquella charmed Mohg. Now, kind of like the Miquella and Saint Trina thing, this isn't really a theory as much as it is a fact, now that we have the context of the DLC. But in the base game, we learned that Miquella was kidnapped out of the Haligtree by Mohg and taken to the underground mausoleum, to eventually become the god of the New Age, with Mohg as his consort for the Mohgwyn dynasty. Now the whole thing felt weird because throughout the entire game, we kept learning that Miquella was this cunning, smart character, and the most fearsome Empyrean, so the fact that he could just be snatched away like this made very little sense. However, now in the DLC it was confirmed that Miquella used his charm on Mohg and bewitched him, as a means to divest himself of his grace in order to reach the land of shadow. So in actuality, Moog was the victim in the situation, entirely taken advantage of and forced to hope for a dynasty that would never come. Marika in a Jar is part of the lore in the DLC that touches on what happened to the shamans and Marika's people and their oppression by the Hornsent. We learn through the lore of Bonnie Village that the shamans were skinned alive and stuffed into the jars in order to become something called a saint. Now, what exactly a saint is, we have no idea, or at least it's not clarified. In the dungeons, we see the product of these jars, and I don't think this is exactly what happened to Marika, because when we see her, clearly this is not what she is. So the theory goes that all of these amalgamations we find are failed saints, and since Marika was the only of her kind to be able to rise above this and ascend to godhood, perhaps she too went through the jar process, but ultimately emerged as a successful saint. The Great Tree is an idea that there was another tree predating the Erdtree that the Erdtree was either grafted onto or took over. And the mushroom theory plays on this a lot because, as we can clearly see, there is a dead tree beneath the gold of the Erdtree, and all of the supposed Erdtree roots are not gold but regular wood. Now, this idea started from the root resin item description, which says, "The roots of the Great Tree were once linked to those of the Erdtree, or so they say, and it is for this reason catacombs are built around Great Tree roots." Now, I think the description there is pretty explicit, but it's been an ongoing debate forever of whether or not there are actually two different trees. But since this is the only mention of the supposed Great Tree, do you think there are actually two or not? Adult Trina is a really interesting one, and even with all the new lore of the DLC, it's still a mystery. This comes from Saint Trina's torch, which has a description that reads, "Candle stand torch that burns with a light purple flame. The carvings depict Saint Trina, but in adult form, somewhat unnervingly." And we can see by the carving here that this depiction of Trina has wild tentacles of hair and a singular eye in the middle, and it does look somewhat unnerving. But this is vastly different than the Trina we see in-game. Though, as we mentioned earlier, we only see Trina after she's been divested from Mikola, and in this state, the only interactions we have with her are her speaking to us words of love and compassion, so we're left with the questions. Why did the maker of the torch depict Saint Trina like this, and what reason did they have to think she was unnerving? Vare killed our maiden. Now, when you start the game, immediately, you'll notice to the right a dead maiden, likely the maiden assigned to our tarnished, and by her death we become maidenless. So we ultimately have to ask, well, how did that maiden die? Well, when the first character we meet in the world is Vare, who not only is covered in blood, but knows that we're maidenless, and also tasks us with killing a maiden later on in his quest, well, it sure looks like he did it. There really isn't a whole lot to say here. Although we don't have definitive proof, there really aren't any other options of who might have been the culprit. He has a motive for a need of maiden's blood, and perhaps finding a maidenless tarnished would be an ideal candidate for a new recruit into the fold of blood. Radagon is Messmer's father. This one is pretty interesting because it's never outright confirmed who Messmer's father is, but we know a few things for certain. Number one, he is a child of Marika. Number two, he has the distinctive red hair of Radagon's children. And number three, he has a curse. Now, pretty much all the evidence that we can gather about Messmer would point to Radagon being the father, but there's a bit of a problem. Depending on how you interpret the game's timeline, the subjugation of the Land of Shadow could have taken place before the union of Marika and Radagon. So you could run into a possibility here that Marika and Radagon were always one being. Now, personally, I don't have any lore issues with it, and I think the fact that Messmer's OST is a play on Radagon's OST is hint enough, but I'm not even sure there are other options than Radagon for who the father might have been. So I'm curious if you think there are, who and why. But on the other side of the coin we have Melina is Marika's daughter. Now this goes hand in hand with Messmer being Radagon's son, as the new item Messmer's Kindling heavily implies that Melina is Messmer's sister. Now even without the DLC, there was more than enough evidence in the base game to conclude that Melina is Marika's daughter, such as the butterfly theory, which we'll talk about later on in the Iceberg, but also that she tells us straight up that her mother is inside the Erdtree, and of course the only person inside the Erdtree is Marika. Now we can take it a step further and realize that the children of Marika and Radagon are all born with a curse. Melania has her scarlet rot, Mikola has his eternal youth, Messmer has the abyssal serpent, and Melina is burned and bodiless. So although it's never outright stated that she is a demigod child of Marika, there is more than enough evidence to conclude very easily that she is. But that is going to conclude the first two tiers of the Elden Ring lore theory Iceberg, and we have a lot more to get through. It's going to get much weirder, with a lot more concepts that even the most experienced lore enthusiast won't know. So if you want me to continue this series, then be sure to let me know by leaving a like on the video and subscribing if you're new around here. But with all that, I will catch you in the next one.